The photograph was taken in 1903, somewhere in rural Kentucky. 12 children stand in a line outside a wooden church. Their faces are solemn, their hands are folded, and if you look closely, really closely, you'll notice something that makes your skin crawl. Every single one of them has the same twisted fingers, the same bent wrists, the same unnatural angle to their hands. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't an accident. This was a bloodline curse that had been repeating itself for 240 years. And when it finally came to light, it revealed one of the most disturbing family secrets ever buried in American soil. What you're about to hear isn't folklore. It's not legend. It's documented medical history that was hidden, ignored, and covered up by an entire community that knew the truth but chose silence over salvation. This is the story of 12 generations born broken and the unthinkable reason why no one stopped it. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The family name has been changed in most records, but the medical journals call them the K family. They lived in the Appalachian foothills, in a county so isolated that the nearest hospital was a full day's ride by horse. The first recorded case appeared in 1761. A boy named Samuel was born with his hands curled inward like claws. His father was a preacher, his mother was a midwife. They knew something was wrong the moment he took his first breath. But Samuel wasn't alone. Over the next 2 centuries, hundreds of children in this family would be born with the exact same deformity. Twisted hands, fused fingers, bones that grew in spirals instead of straight lines. And the family did something unthinkable. They kept marrying each other, generation after generation, cousin to cousin, uncle to niece. They isolated themselves. They hid their children from the outside world, and they prayed that God would fix what they refused to admit they had broken. By 1832, the pattern was undeniable. Church records from 3 counties showed the same surnames appearing over and over in marriage certificates. The K family had branched into 4 main lines, but those lines kept weaving back together like threads in a noose. A man named Elijah married his first cousin Ruth. Their son Thomas married his second cousin Mary. Mary's daughter married Mary's nephew. The family tree didn't branch outward, it folded inward, collapsing on itself like a house built on rotten wood. And with each generation, the deformity became more severe. The early cases showed minor bone abnormalities, fingers that bent slightly wrong, thumbs that sat too low on the hand. But by the mid-1800s, children were being born with hands that looked like they'd been melted and reformed. Some couldn't grip, some couldn't write, some couldn't feed themselves. Medical journals from the time describe one boy whose fingers had fused together into a single mass of bone and skin, leaving him with what looked like mittens instead of hands. The family called it the mark. They believed it was a test from God, a burden they had to carry in silence. If you were born with the mark, you were kept inside. You didn't go to school. You didn't go to town. You worked the farm until your twisted hands gave out, and then you sat by the fire and prayed for children who might be born whole. But they never were. Doctors began to take notice in 1879, when a traveling physician passed through the county and saw 3 children with identical deformities sitting on the same porch. He asked questions. The family refused to answer. He tried to examine the children. The father chased him off with a shotgun. The doctor reported what he saw to the state medical board, but nothing was done. This was Appalachia. This was the Bible Belt. Families handled their own business, and outsiders weren't welcome. But the doctor kept records. He sketched the children's hands. He noted their ages, their parents' names, their family connections. And when he died 30 years later, those records were found in a trunk in his attic. They were the first documentation of what would later be called the K family syndrome, a genetic disorder so rare and so concentrated that it could only exist in a population that had been breeding within itself for generations. The drawings are still preserved in a medical archive in Virginia. If you look at them, you'll see hands that don't look human anymore, fingers twisted into knots, wrists bent at 90-degree angles, bones that grew sideways instead of forward, and beneath each sketch, the doctor wrote the same note in shaking handwriting: This family is destroying itself, and they will not stop. The thing that makes this story truly disturbing isn't just what the family did to itself. It's what everyone else allowed to happen. Because by 1900, the entire county knew. The school teachers knew. The shopkeepers knew. The ministers knew. They'd all seen the children with twisted hands sitting in the back pews of churches, hidden behind their mothers' skirts. They'd all heard the whispers about which cousins were courting, which bloodlines were tangling together again. And they said nothing. There's a phrase that appears over and over in oral histories from that region. We minded our business. When researchers finally began interviewing residents in the 1960s, trying to understand how this could have gone on for so long, that's what they heard. We minded our business. It wasn't our place. They were good Christian people. They kept to themselves. Every excuse was a brick in the wall that trapped those children in their genetic prison. One former teacher, interviewed in 1967, admitted she'd had 4 students from the K family over her 30-year career. All 4 had the deformity. All 4 struggled to hold a pencil. She never reported it. She never asked questions. When pressed about why, she said something chilling. Everyone knew if you got involved with that family, bad things happened. A pastor tried to counsel them in 1923 about the marriages. His church burned down 3 weeks later. Nobody could prove anything, but nobody forgot it either. The family had become untouchable, not through wealth or power, but through fear and isolation. They owned hundreds of acres in the hills. They rarely came to town. When they did, people looked away. Store owners sold them supplies without making eye contact. The children with visible deformities were kept home, but everyone knew they existed. It was an open secret that had become so normalized that it stopped feeling like a secret at all. It was just how things were. Just another strange, sad fact of life in a place where the old ways died hard and outsiders were never trusted. But the family wasn't just hiding from the world. They were hiding from themselves. Letters discovered in a demolished farmhouse in 1994 revealed that some family members had tried to break the pattern. In 1931, a young woman named Elizabeth wrote to her sister that she was moving to Ohio to marry a man from outside the family. The letter was found torn into pieces, stuffed behind a wall. Elizabeth never made it to Ohio. Her death certificate, filed 6 months later, listed cause of death as accidental fall. She was 21 years old. Another letter, dated 1946, was written by a teenage boy to his uncle. He begged to be allowed to leave, to go to the city, to find work somewhere his hands wouldn't mark him as cursed. The uncle's response was found paper-clipped to the original. It was 1 sentence long. You were born into this family, and you'll die in it. That's God's will. The truth finally cracked open in 1958, and it happened because of one person who refused to look away. Her name was Dr. Margaret Hollins, a geneticist from Johns Hopkins University who had been studying inherited disorders in isolated populations. She'd heard rumors about a family in Kentucky with an unusually high rate of skeletal abnormalities. She applied for a research grant. She drove 8 hours into the mountains, and when she knocked on the door of the main family homestead, she was met by a woman holding a baby with hands that looked like they'd been wrung out and twisted like wet cloth. Dr. Hollins didn't ask permission. She didn't wait for an invitation. She told the woman she could help, that there were treatments, that the cycle could be broken. The woman stared at her for a long time. Then she whispered 6 words that would haunt Dr. Hollins for the rest of her life. We've been waiting for someone brave. Over the next 3 years, Dr. Hollins documented 27 living family members with the deformity. She took X-rays. She drew blood samples. She built family trees that looked less like trees and more like webs, with the same names appearing in multiple generations, connected by lines that should never have existed. What she discovered was worse than anyone had imagined. The defect wasn't just genetic, it was getting stronger. With each generation of intermarriage, the mutation amplified. Early cases showed maybe 20% bone malformation. By the 1950s, some children were being born with hands that were 80% non-functional. But the most disturbing discovery wasn't medical, it was cultural. Dr. Hollins found evidence that the family had developed an entire belief system around the deformity. They believed the twisted hands were a sign of spiritual purity, that God had marked them as chosen, that marrying outsiders would dilute the bloodline and anger the Lord. There were journals passed down through generations that described the deformity as the covenant in flesh, a physical reminder of their family's special relationship with God. One journal entry from 1897 read, "Sarah born this morning with the mark strong upon her. Praise be, the Lord has shown us again that we are his faithful. Her hands are twisted like the roots of the old oak, and we know she will grow strong in his sight." The handwriting was careful, practiced. This wasn't the rambling of someone mentally ill. This was doctrine. This was faith twisted into something unrecognizable. Dr. Hollins tried to convince the family to stop the intermarriage. She explained genetics in simple terms. She showed them the X-rays, the evidence of bone deterioration, the proof that their children were suffering. Some of the younger members listened. A few even agreed to marry outside the family, but the elders refused. They called her a deceiver. They said she was testing their faith. One elderly man told her, "You come here with your science and your city ways, but you don't understand. This is our burden, this is our blessing, and it's not for you to take away." She left Kentucky in 1961 with enough data to publish 3 groundbreaking papers on genetic drift and founder effects in isolated populations. The K family became a case study in medical schools. But Dr. Hollins never published the family's real name. She never revealed their exact location. When asked why, she said she'd made a promise to the woman who first let her in that she'd tell the truth, but she'd protect them from becoming a spectacle. The most heartbreaking part of this story isn't the deformity itself. It's what happened to the children who lived with it. Because while the medical community was studying chromosomes and bone density, real human beings were growing up inside a prison made of their own DNA. They had names, they had dreams, and they had hands that made the world treat them like they were something less than human. Court records from the 1940s show that several K family children were denied enrollment in public schools, not because of their academic ability, but because their appearance disturbed other students. One school board meeting transcript from 1947 includes a mother's testimony, begging them to let her son attend. She said he could read better than most kids his age, that he was gentle and kind, that he just wanted to learn. The board voted 5-1 to reject him. The reason given was concerns about hygiene and the child's ability to complete written assignments. That boy's name was James. He would have been 12 years old. There's no record of what happened to him after that rejection, but census data shows he never left the family property. He died in 1983, at age 48, never having worked a job outside the farm, never having left the county he was born in. There were others. A girl named Ruth, who wanted to be a teacher but couldn't hold chalk long enough to practice writing on a board. A boy named Daniel, who loved music but couldn't position his fingers on any instrument. A young woman named Caroline, who was engaged to a man from a neighboring county, someone outside the family, until his parents saw her hands and called off the wedding. She never married. She died alone in 2006, in the same house where she was born. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The physical pain was only part of their suffering. Medical records describe chronic joint inflammation, early onset arthritis, nerve damage that caused constant tingling or numbness. But the psychological damage was deeper. These children grew up being told they were blessed while being treated like they were cursed. They were taught that their deformity was holy while watching the world recoil from them. They were trapped between 2 contradictory truths, that they were special and that they were broken. Some tried to hide. They wore gloves year-round, even in summer heat. They kept their hands in their pockets during conversations. They learned to do everything with their wrists and forearms, opening doors, picking up objects, even eating, just to avoid showing their fingers. Others went the opposite direction. They displayed their hands openly, almost defiantly, as if daring people to stare. One man, interviewed in the 1990s, said he used to hold his hands up in front of strangers and say, "Go ahead and look, get it over with. Then maybe we can talk like normal people." But the cruelest irony is that many of them internalized the family's beliefs. They defended the intermarriage. They argued that outsiders wouldn't understand, that the bloodline needed to stay pure, that their children's deformities were part of God's plan. The trauma had been passed down so thoroughly that even the victims had become its protectors. They'd been conditioned to see their suffering as sacred. By the 1970s, the world had changed, but the K family hadn't. The civil rights movement had swept through America. The genetic code had been cracked. Medical ethics had evolved. And yet, deep in those Kentucky hills, cousins were still marrying cousins, and children were still being born with hands that didn't work. The isolation that had protected the family for 2 centuries was finally crumbling, but not because they wanted it to. It was crumbling because the outside world had finally decided to force its way in. It started with social services. A school teacher in a neighboring county reported seeing a young girl with severe hand deformities being kept out of school. This time, unlike in the past, someone actually investigated. A social worker drove out to the family property in 1973 and found 6 children under the age of 12, 4 of them with visible skeletal abnormalities. The family insisted the children were homeschooled. The social worker asked to see lesson plans. There were none. She asked to see medical records. The family said they didn't believe in doctors. The case went to family court. For the first time in the K family's history, their practices were being examined under legal scrutiny. Child Protective Services argued that the children were being medically neglected and educationally deprived. The family's lawyers argued religious freedom, parental rights, and cultural tradition. The judge was caught between constitutional protections and obvious harm. In the end, he ordered that all K family children under 18 receive medical evaluations and that any child born with severe deformities be given access to corrective surgery and physical therapy. The family complied on paper. They took the children to doctors. They signed the forms, but they never followed through with treatments. Appointments were missed. Prescriptions went unfilled. When social workers showed up unannounced, the children with the worst deformities were suddenly nowhere to be found. The system tried, but it couldn't penetrate walls that had been built over 12 generations. Then came the genetic counseling programs of the 1980s. Health departments in rural areas started offering free testing for hereditary conditions. A young couple from the K family, both in their early 20s, went in for testing before they got married. They were third cousins. The genetic counselor explained what the tests showed: a 93% chance that any child they had together would be born with severe skeletal abnormalities. The counselor begged them to reconsider, showed them photographs from medical journals, explained about adoption, about marrying outside the family, about breaking the cycle. They got married anyway. 2 years later, their daughter was born with the most severe case the local hospital had ever seen. Her hands were barely recognizable as hands. The bones had grown in spirals, twisting around each other like braided rope. She would never be able to feed herself, never be able to dress herself, never be able to live independently. The hospital reported it as medical neglect. The parents were charged. The case made regional newspapers, and for the first time, the K family's secret was no longer a secret. The public reaction was split. Some people expressed outrage, demanding investigations into how this had been allowed to continue. Others defended the family's right to live as they chose, calling it government overreach and religious persecution. Message boards and early internet forums debated whether the family were victims of their own ignorance or villains who deliberately harmed their children. But lost in all that debate were the children themselves, the ones who were living with the consequences of decisions they never made. By the 2000s, DNA testing had become cheap and accessible. Several younger K family members took tests out of curiosity and discovered just how closely related they actually were. Some were horrified. Some left the family entirely, moving to cities where no one knew their history. But others doubled down, insisting that the family's way of life was under attack and needed to be preserved. The family fractured. Lawsuits were filed over property. Siblings stopped speaking. The unity that had kept them isolated for so long finally broke apart under the weight of truth they could no longer deny. Today, in 2025, there are still members of the K family living in Kentucky. The intermarriage has mostly stopped, but not entirely. And the children born with the deformity, the last generation of them, now grown into adults, are living with a question that has no good answer. What do you do with a legacy built on suffering? Some have chosen silence. They don't talk about their hands. They don't tell people their family name. They've had surgeries when possible, worn prosthetics when necessary, and tried to build lives that look nothing like the ones their grandparents lived. They've married people from different states, different backgrounds, different gene pools. Their children are born with straight fingers and working hands. The curse, for them, has finally ended. But ending the curse doesn't erase it. One woman, now in her 50s, spoke anonymously to a documentary crew in 2018. Her hands are twisted but functional. She's had 7 surgeries. She works as a librarian, and she said something that cuts to the heart of this entire story. People ask me if I'm angry at my family for what they did, and the truth is, I don't know how to be angry at people who were just as trapped as I am. My great-great-grandmother didn't choose to be born into this. Neither did my grandmother. Neither did my mother. Neither did I. We were all just links in a chain that nobody knew how to break. That's the uncomfortable truth that this story forces us to face. There are no clear villains here. There are people who made terrible choices, yes. People who prioritized tradition over the welfare of children. People who saw suffering and chose to call it sacred rather than preventable. But many of those people were themselves victims of a system that started long before they were born. They inherited beliefs the same way they inherited broken bones. And by the time anyone realized how wrong it all was, generations had already been lost. The medical community now uses the K family as a teaching case, not just about genetics, but about the dangers of isolation, the importance of genetic diversity, and the ways that culture and religion can be twisted to justify harm. Students in medical ethics classes study the decisions made by doctors who knew about the family but didn't intervene. They debate what responsibility healthcare providers have when patients refuse help. They ask themselves what they would have done differently, knowing what those doctors didn't know, that the suffering would continue for another 50 years. But here's what haunts me most about this story. It's not the twisted hands. It's not even the willful ignorance of the community. It's the realization that somewhere in America right now, there are other families like this. Other bloodlines collapsing inward. Other children being born into genetic prisons built by their ancestors. Other communities staying silent because it's easier than getting involved. We like to think the K family is an anomaly, a relic of a less enlightened time. But isolation still exists. Insular communities still exist. And the same forces that trapped those 12 generations, fear, tradition, pride, and silence, are still operating today. The photograph from 1903 still exists. It's in a medical archive at a university that won't disclose which one. Because even now, even after everything, there are family members who don't want to be identified. Those 12 children standing in front of that church are all dead now. So are their children. And their children's children. But their DNA lives on, their story lives on, and the question their lives pose lives on too. How many generations of suffering are we willing to ignore before we decide that someone else's privacy matters less than a child's right to be born whole? How do we balance cultural respect with medical intervention? And when does a family's right to self-determination end and society's responsibility to protect the vulnerable begin? There are no easy answers. But there is one thing I know for certain. Those children deserved better. They deserved a world that valued their futures more than it valued their family's secrets. They deserved adults who were brave enough to tell the truth, even when the truth was ugly. They deserved to be born with hands that worked. And if their story does nothing else, maybe it can serve as a reminder that silence is never neutral, that looking away is always a choice, and that the cruelest inheritance we can pass to the next generation isn't genetic, it's the lie that some suffering is too sacred to prevent. If this story affected you the way it affected me, leave a comment below. Tell me what you think. Tell me if you've heard similar stories from your own community. And subscribe, because there are more buried truths like this one, waiting to be uncovered. Stories that need to be told, especially when they make us uncomfortable. Because the past isn't just history. It's a warning, and we ignore it at our own risk.